On a recent episode of The Sausage Factory, we discussed if it was healthy to go see everything in the genre, not just for the viewer, but also for the genre itself. Should you go out and watch every horror movie that comes out in theater to give a financial support so that more films continue to get made? And while my answer to that is fairly nuanced, I don't think that you can say outright yes or no to that question. It involves a little bit of common sense and a whole lot of history. But that said, this weekend I went to see 3 commercially released horror films in theaters. Now, only one of them had a true national-wide release, and that movie was Brahms' The Boy 2. But I also saw Hammer Films' The Lodge, which is in a much more limited release. It looks like the AMC theater chain is doing it a lot of help, but not a lot of other national chains are. And finally, if you've watched my earlier video, you know this, and you know my feelings on it. I saw an Indian import, Bhoot Part 1, The Haunted Ship. This year has been a tough year for me and the horror genre in theaters. I can't say that until this weekend I truly liked any of the films I saw. Some were okay, but just barely so. And I hadn't found any films to really champion domestically. There had been another import earlier in the year, Psycho, which was actually very good if you like giallo films. I would definitely recommend that film to anyone who likes early Argento or Sergio Martino or Lucio Fulci's giallo work, but I wouldn't give it as high a recommendation to someone who's not already aware of that subgenre and has a real taste to it. So far this year, a month and a half in, there hadn't been anything that I was screaming to the sky that everyone needs to go see. And this weekend changed that. I like having good news to give. And that's why I rushed to make a video about Bhoot. But now I wish I had waited, and I probably would cover it in this video fully. But since I already did, here we are. I saw Bhoot on Friday, and I did see it at a theater as part of a major chain. In fact, I was even able to use my pass, which allowed me to get in for just my monthly fee. So it is important to check your listings and don't just look at the theater down the street. If you have to drive a few extra miles, it may really be worth it. That's the lesson of this. And then on Saturday, I saw The Lodge. And yesterday, Sunday, I saw Brahms' The Boy Part 2. Now, I'm not going to hold you in any suspense here. The Lodge is the film that's going to satisfy most horror fans. It's unremittingly dark. It has a nice bleak ending, and that's not a spoiler. If you watch the first 10 minutes of this film, you're well aware that it just is not going to end happily. It is a Greek tragedy in the most literal sense. There's so much dramatic work being done here to tell a very simple story. And yes, the plot is like shifting sands under the viewer's feet, but it's not a terribly difficult movie to follow. In fact, I'd say it's probably the easiest of the 3. It is a film, however, that's not going to do much for the casual moviegoer who only occasionally sees a horror film and is kind of picky about what they do go to see in the genre. It's really a film that is for the hardcore horror fan that doesn't mind going to extremely dark places. Bhoot Part 1 is kind of the opposite. It is a film made for a very wide audience, in this case the mainstream Indian moviegoer. That said, there's nothing about the movie that feels particularly Indian, except the cast and language it spoke. All the cultural references translate just fine, and although some of the dialogue suffers a little bit from translation, you're never at a loss to why people are doing what they're doing, or there's no cultural obstruction to give you pause. Bhoot is a smart mainstream horror film, and that's something that hasn't happened yet this year and was in short supply for the last couple years. So I heavily recommend going to see it. See that? I just recommended 2 new films that are in theaters right now. It's tempting to say that this weekend could change the entire trajectory of the horror genre for the year. But then, on Sunday, as I mentioned, I went to go see Brahms' The Boy Part 2. Just to be fair, I never saw the first film, but I knew what it was from the trailers. I understood the plot twist from the trailers. It seemed like something that I had seen before. In fact, I had seen Bad Ronald, and I think I would have respected and probably even gone to see The Boy had it just copped the fact that it was robbing that television movie blind. There was nothing about the trailers for Brahms, The Boy 2, that made me particularly interested in the film. It looked like a completely standard haunted doll movie. And yet, given the opportunity and the fact that I was able to use my pass, so there was no cash out of my pocket except the gas, I went. It is the very definition of an average horror film, and the important thing to keep in mind here is that the movie I saw, had it been released in, say, '83, would have been received a whole lot better. I think we all would be still talking about it as a movie that did really well in its time and place. The problem is, it's not 1983, it is 2020, and we've seen all the tropes in this movie so many times, done so often at a high level. And while I wouldn't say that this movie is inferior to any of the films that's come before it using these same tactics, it's no better. It's not earth-shattering. It doesn't have that twist that makes you reappreciate all these gimmicks. It's just a haunted doll movie. It borrows liberally from a lot of films we've seen before, whether it is the original Dead of Night, an excellent film, whether we're talking about Magic with Anthony Hopkins, whether we're talking about the original Child's Play, or in my opinion, probably the most memorable haunted doll of all, from The Twilight Zone. It's just a movie you don't need to see. There's nothing pressing about it. But it's that weird example of a film that can't seem to figure out that it shouldn't have been made at this time. It's a D+ today, but had it come out when it should have come out, a couple decades ago, it probably would be a B-, or maybe even just a straight B. So if you have a tolerance for films that are just programmers, they're just standard bearers, they're just typical, then you may really enjoy it. But here's the thing. 3 movies in one weekend, and all 3 of them performed better than I had hoped they would. My expectations for Brahms were really on the floor. The Lodge I had high hopes for, but I've had too many high hopes dashed in recent history. I wasn't expecting Hammer's newest film to be their take on the A24 films, but it was. I've liked some of Hammer's newer releases. I didn't really care for the Women in Black movies, but I really did quite like the Quiet Ones. This neatly stands next to the best work of Hammer since their heyday. And that's a really impressive thing. And when it comes to Bhoot, I thought the trailer looked awful. I was just hopeful because the entire Indian horror industry that's come up in recent years has been so promising that I couldn't turn away. I had to give it the benefit of the doubt, and I'm glad I did, because that thing in the trailer that I hated, is a really cliche, dumb special effect, isn't in the movie. Now, I do want to say that all 3 of these films do have another thing in common. And it's an interesting thing in common, because it shows the range of effectiveness of a single technique. All 3 have a decent amount of jump scares in them. But they're very different types of jump scares with different impact. And that's because when they occur in Brahms, they're pretty cheap. When they occur in Bhoot, they affect the plot, and they actually move the plot forward. The ghostly attacks are sudden and loud, but they are real attacks. In the case of The Lodge, the jump scares actually inform a key character's state of mind and puts you in her shoes. So when we talk about jump scares, we should be careful not to say that all jump scares are bad. Not even cheap jump scares are bad necessarily. I always go back to Friday the 13th Part 2 as an example, because most everyone watching this video will have seen the film. It does the most cliched jump scare imaginable. A cat jumps through a window to scare the heroine of the first film. And it's a cheap jump scare, and then we relieve our energy immediately after with a quick laugh because we recognize it is cheap. And then the film hits us with a genuine scare right after it. So just as we're releasing the tension, we get hit with a real scare. That's a proper use of even a cheap jump scare. Brahms is not so lucky. We have bad dream sequences that end with dodgy special effects. We have things jumping into frame and loud sounds coming, and then the characters and we relax and just go on with the film. In other words, the filmmaker was just looking for a reaction, even if he wasn't willing to back it up with story. But I want to stay positive. The 3 films I saw this weekend were all better than I expected, and I'm hoping that this will set off a chain. And maybe this year won't be as bad as it looks on paper. We'll get more like we got this weekend. I remain hopeful. Let me know your feelings on any of these 3 films. Did you see any? Do you want to see them? Are you frustrated that it's difficult to see some of them? Leave your comments below, and let's start a conversation.